So I really do want us to get a deal. I think that will be the best outcome, but we've got to prepare prudently for every eventuality.
The revelations on Operation Yellowhammer and preparations suggested that no deal is hardly straightforward. What are the remaining challenges?
Well, Operation Yellowhammer was a reasonable worst-case scenario, so it sets out things that would happen if you didn't take steps to mitigate them. And we have taken steps, and so has business. The particular challenge that we face, and there are two. There's one which relates to flow over the short straits between Dover and Calais. A significant proportion of our trade, much more than in the past, goes from Dover direct to Calais. And again, one of the things about that trade at the moment is you will have an HGV that will arrive at Dover. It will roll onto the ferry and roll off at Calais. And that frictionless trade has been one of the features of the single market. Now, that will change in the event of no deal. To be fair to the French, they have invested in a smart borders system that means that if businesses do have the right paperwork and the right barcodes, then there's no reason why any goods should be delayed. But we can't guarantee that every business will have made those preparations. So the first challenge is helping business to prepare. Then the second challenge is there are some businesses which, even with the best preparation in the world, are likely to face tariffs. The EU's common external tariff wall will be applied to us in the event of no deal, almost certainly, as a third country. The average EU tariff is 4%, but they're higher particularly for agricultural produce, and in particular for meat, and in particular for beef and lamb, given that we export so much of our lamb to the European Union. One of the most exposed sectors is sheep farming, and that's why we have particular steps in place in order to support sheep farmers, should it be the case that we leave without a deal. But the final thing that I'd say is that leaving without a deal, while it poses challenges, also creates opportunities, and also it is the case that leaving without a deal is not an end point. I don't think there's anyone, there may be some, but I don't think there's anyone who thinks that we should have as a permanent relationship with the EU, trading as a third country on WTO terms. So even though the process of getting a new deal under what's called Article 218 will be slightly different from the current process, we will eventually, if we leave without a deal, move towards a new trading relationship with the EU.
But you were deeply worried about no deal earlier this year. It was one of the major things which drove you to vote for the May deal. Are you still as worried, or are you?
Well, I think there are two things.
You managed to reassure yourself.
There are two things. You can't be blind or blasé about the consequences of no deal. You've got to prepare, but the preparations have stepped up significantly since Boris became Prime Minister. One of the things beforehand is that there were some in government who argued, look, if you lead in and you say you're really preparing for no deal and it's a live eventuality, it will have an economic impact. So we've got to avoid saying that we are ready for it and braced for it and prepared for it. Boris's view, the government's view, is different, that actually it's only if you prepare for no deal that you both can deal with whatever eventualities there are, but also emphasise and underline your seriousness towards a deal. And I think that's the right approach. So additional preparations have helped to reduce and mitigate some of those risks. But the other thing is that I've always taken the view that it is better to leave with a deal. One of the problems that we have, however, is that the deal that Theresa brought before the House of Commons hasn't been able to secure parliamentary support. The one thing that we know in the past did secure a majority was Graham Brady's amendment, which said we can leave if we can have a replacement for the backstop.
So the next scenario, a deal, is there actually even sufficient time for a deal to be done?
Yes, there is. Time is pressing, but it is the case that we can, in the period, in this weekend, next week, in the run-up to October the 12th, there will be intensive talks with the European Union. We know broadly what the outline of a deal might look like. If we can secure progress on all sides, then we can get a deal agreed before the October Council. We can have it signed off at the October Council, and we can then, provided Parliament is prepared to sit at weekends, and MPs have shown an amazing willingness recently to come back into the House of Commons, then I'm sure that we can encourage many of those people who were so anxious for Parliament to be restored to spend the odd Saturday or Sunday making sure we can get a deal done.
So the landing zone is that small. It is, you have to have a deal in the next 10 days.
Well, That's the ideal.
to 2 weeks, because you can't have a situation, presumably, in which this is still an open question by the time of the European Council.
That's the situation I've outlined is the ideal one. But there have been situations where Europe has, or the EU has, taken things to the wire. In a superb BBC series of documentaries about how the EU works, broadcast earlier this year, we saw how when we had the Greek crisis, how the EU would debate and deal make late into the night and early into the morning in order to get things done. So ideally we would have a proposition that was ready for the European Council, but it may well be the case that things go right to the wire.
Do you think, though, there's obviously a changing of the guard happening in Brussels as well, von der Leyen coming in and the old guard going out. If Brussels is looking at the events of the last few days and weeks in the UK, Parliament, business around the Supreme Court, government without a majority, is von der Leyen, in alliance with Macron, her ally, are they really going to spend political capital on giving you a deal which might not pass Parliament?
Well, the first thing is, you're absolutely right, power is shifting in the EU to the new Commission, but the old Commission, and the old President of the Council, as it were, so Jean-Claude Juncker, Michel Barnier, his negotiator, Donald Tusk, they all want a deal before October the 31st. They want their term to end with this matter settled. And more broadly, I think the European Union, not only, there were some people, immediately after the referendum, who hoped that there would be a second referendum and that we would reverse it. Now the prevailing view in the EU is, let's make sure that we can have a clean departure. And one of the reasons why, I think, is that if it were to be the case that, by some mischance you had, say, a Jeremy Corbyn government, and that Jeremy Corbyn government sought to secure an extension in order to have a referendum, the EU would face this situation, as we both know, where they're negotiating with Labour. Labour are asking for things that the EU has never granted, like a membership of the customs union and a say in EU trade deals while being outside the EU. If by some miracle Labour were to get that deal, with the EU having said to them, all right, we'll give you a better deal than anyone has ever had outside, Labour would then take this deal back, and half the shadow cabinet and the deputy leader would campaign against the deal in order to remain, while Jeremy Corbyn would remain gnomically, elliptically uncertain until the last minute about whether or not the deal that he had negotiated was any good at all. Let's imagine, at the end of that we vote to remain and reject Jeremy Corbyn's New Deal by 51% to 49%. Does anyone think, certainly anyone in Europe, that would be a sustainable position for the future? I think from the EU's point of view, while of course it will negotiate hard, it can see this process, unless it's dealt with in a clean and constructive way soon, becoming a distraction, to put it at its best, from their desire to deal with their own institutional architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that the Labour strategy is a suboptimal strategy. But the Tories are having rather extreme difficulties of their own. Aren't we going to face the situation that if there is a deal done in the next fortnight, it looks very like Theresa May's deal?
No,
it may be in a different font. Times New Roman rather than Garamond.
Yes.
It may have slightly different provisions on Northern Ireland, but ultimately it's going to be an adaptation of May's deal, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I think there are some things which I hope will remain the same in any withdrawal agreement, so the guarantees on the rights of EU citizens I think would remain the same, and I think aspects of the political declaration, which of course we can change, should remain the same, though we do need to change it, point it towards something close to a free trade agreement of the kind I mentioned. But there will be changes with respect to Northern Ireland and how the backstop operates, which will make it a significantly different document. And I think that we know from the difficulties that Theresa had in the House of Commons that the backstop and some of the questions around it were the principal obstacle to getting a deal through.
Is it fair to say that the British, in terms of negotiating, have been somewhat unrealistic about what's possible? And are we at risk again of making a similar mistake on the backstop, and that ultimately not going to change the backstop in a way that convinces sufficient number of Conservative MPs?
Well, everything about this process will involve compromise for everyone. And the question, I think, facing the EU is if there's no compromise at all from the current position, especially since EU member state leaders have said that they're prepared to look at the withdrawal agreement and they're prepared to look at the backstop. If there's no compromise at all, then we go back to the scenario that I mentioned earlier. And I can't believe that the EU would want a situation where we are continually negotiating a deal with a new Labour or other Prime Minister, and this process is endlessly delayed. It would be paralysing for the EU and not in our interests. So I think that, of course, the EU, like any negotiator, will want to publicly stand tough, but ultimately some form of compromise or agreement is in everyone's interests.
And what about an extension, even if it was very short?
Well, during the course of the Conservative Party leadership election, one particular candidate said that if it was necessary to delay for a month, a week, or a day in order to get the deal through, that might be contemplatable. That particular candidate, however, lost the election and lost the argument. So, we've got to focus on that, and making sure that you have a firm deadline concentrates minds, both in the EU and in our own Parliament.
Do you think it's more likely that the Remain forces in Parliament try and remove Boris this week, or are they going to wait till around the sort of 18th, 19th? How do you think it's going to play out?
I don't know. I think, looking at it, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But they trying to make this calculation about precisely the point at which you have a general election in order, A, to overturn the referendum, then B, to maximise your votes. And as I understand from the SNP, trying to have a general election because there are certain events occurring elsewhere which you worry will undermine your position. I think we'll see that that's the height of cynicism. And curiously, when I think it was the Times asked people in Stoke what they thought about this whole situation, what they saw was the Prime Minister trying to keep the promise that Parliament had kept with the country, and a variety of different people manoeuvring in order to try to undermine him, undermine that promise, and accentuate their own political advantage. And they weren't very impressed by it. So, in a way, the more that you see each of these individual parties trying to calculate specific advantage rather than just making a principled argument about what they think is right, I think the less good for them, the less good for democracy overall, but I don't want to be too pious about it.
But if the number 10 strategy was to bring all this to a head in dramatic fashion, it's certainly done that, hasn't it?
The strategy has always been to try to get Brexit done, and to invite the House of Commons to do what it hasn't done for 3 years, which is to make a decision. We have been in a situation where the House of Commons has told us repeatedly what it doesn't like, but not what it does. Having a cut-off point on October the 31st, where if you don't vote for a deal, then no deal is the default option, concentrates minds on the wisdom of voting for a deal. You've seen some very good Labour MPs, from Stephen Kinnock to Gloria De Piero, saying now that they really do want to support a deal. So it's created the right sort of dynamic, I think.
And you're famed in parliamentary terms for always being very polite at the dispatch box. What was your perspective on last week's events?
Well, I try to be polite. I don't always succeed. But there was a very good letter in the Times from Joe Haynes, who I'm sure everyone here remembers was the press secretary for Harold Wilson. And in it, he described some of the comments that were made when he was operating in the House of Commons in the 1960s and 1970s. Everything, including, I can't remember who it was, but I think it was Harold Wilson, saying that Sir Bernard Brain's name was something of a misnomer, through to some more lurid language. We all remember that Nye Bevan, whom we laud as a hero for understandable reasons, said in a general election campaign that the Tories were lower than vermin. So, we've had robust language in the past. Obviously, we should be careful about how we use language in politics, but having robust language in political debate is just, that's part of our history.
Let's consider another scenario, which is possibly for reasons above and beyond your control. Britain ends up not leaving on October the 31st. What happens to the Conservative Party in that scenario?
Well, I wrote an article for the Sunday Times a wee while, 9 days ago, in which I said that the Conservative Party was on the razor edge of peril. And I think that if we don't leave on October the 31st, and I'm convinced we will leave before then, but if we don't leave, then I think that people will feel a profound sense of disappointment, because we saw in March the 29th, when it was the case that a decent and brave Prime Minister was thwarted from being able to take us out of the European Union, that the effect on the Conservative Party and faith in our democracy was not great. So I think that I'm sure we will, but I think it's important for anyone who thinks that there might be any merit in delay to contemplate what that would do to confidence, not just in this government, but in Parliament overall.
But it presumably creates an even worse problem for the Tories with the Brexit Party. It boosts them, doesn't it?
Well, one of the things, again, that's I think, a challenge at the moment is that faith in our institutions, faith in our democratic institutions, depends, I think, it depends on many things, but one of the things it depends on at the moment is honouring that promise. There are some people who treat the referendum in 2016 as though it were merely a giant opinion poll, and that MPs could say, very interesting, but thank you, I'm going to get on with our membership of the EU. I don't think you can do that. It was the case that every politician who took part in that referendum said, your vote matters. I quoted Patty Ashdown earlier today. And everyone who voted knowing that it matters. If we don't honour that, then that will have an undermining effect on our democracy overall. If that happens, then you will have populist movements that will be strengthened, and I don't think that would be a good thing. I think if we look beyond the UK, there's a tendency sometimes to think that Brexit is a unique phenomenon. I think if you look across Western democracies, you can see democratic institutions under strain, and part of the reason that they are under strain is because there's been a sense that the decision makers, whether in business or in politics or elsewhere, have been insulated, detached and aloof from the public, and I think that is dangerous. Now, there are certain times when you need to show political leadership. There are certain times where you need to say, I know it would be easy to do X, but I'm going to do Y, of course. But when you do something as fundamental as saying to people, we're going to ask you to make this big decision about the life of our nation, then not to implement it, I think would lead to damage to our democracy.
What about the courts and politics, which is an area that Policy Exchange has done a lot of brilliant work on?
Yes.
This question of judicial activism.
Yes.
Do you think, as a result of what happened last week, that Britain is headed for some form of written constitution, try and codify all of this, and specifically the role of the Supreme Court?
No, I don't think so. I think several things. The first thing is that I actually think that the Supreme Court did the job that was expected of it. And we can have a discussion about the reasoning behind the judgment, and people will quite rightly point out, as I have, that the Lord Chief Justice took a different view, and Policy Exchange has just published a fascinating paper by Professor John Finnis, one of the foremost legal minds in the country, taking issue with some of the Supreme Court's reasoning. I would recommend to everyone here both reading the Supreme Court's reasoning and reading Professor Finnis's report. I think if you read them both together, that gives you a proper understanding of the arguments either way. But ultimately, it's the Supreme Court's job at certain points to, when cases are taken, either decide on whether or not an appeal against a High Court judgment should be upheld, and also to act as a corrective against the legislature and the executive at certain points. So I think, in that sense, no. I think one of the things about constitutional change and constitutional reform is you should always carcani, you should always be careful and cautious about it. We have had the principle of judicial review for years now. Some have argued that it has gone too far. That is a perfectly proper view to take, but I think our country is stronger because of the principle of judicial review.
But it seems it's impossible, presumably, to go back to a situation pre-Blair in terms of how the system worked. So you can't really go backwards. The system exists as it does now with a Supreme Court that has exhibited that it's prepared to be really quite punchy. In those circumstances, isn't there going to be a legitimate demand from voters to know more about people who are being appointed to the Supreme Court? Isn't there then a case for public hearings, an entirely different approach to the debate around how they're appointed?
I'm naturally small c conservative when it comes to constitutional reform. I'm prepared to be radical in all sorts of other areas, but with the Constitution, I think you should be careful and reflect. So I'm not attracted to that idea. I think one of the former justices of the Supreme Court, Jonathan Sumption, has been out and about over the course of the past fortnight. He made the point, he said three things which I think are interesting and worth reflecting on. The first is that he said that if he had been Attorney General, he would have given the same legal advice as Geoffrey Cox, but he also sympathised with the position that the Supreme Court took, thus showing, which I think is the right thing to do, that you can respect the Supreme Court's judgment, but also perhaps have come to a different conclusion. The third thing that he said is that, not that he said, that he's argued in the Reith Lectures and in his new book, is that it may well be the case that when we look at human rights and we look at the courts, that we need to reflect on the consequences of the HRA, and he's made some very interesting arguments there. And I think that someone as thoughtful as Lord Sumption has made these points mean that this is a period of constitutional reflection. When the American founding fathers were deciding on their constitution and everything that flowed, they had the Federalist Papers being written, Hamilton, Madison, and others were involved in that conversation. It is entirely understandable in the age of a 280-character instant response political culture for people to want to take a very strong position on this. My own view on this matter is be thoughtful, recognize that our constitution evolves, respectfully take issue on certain occasions, but try to take a sort of balanced approach.
Now, we're going to move to some questions. I just wanted to ask you finally, on the Constitution, about the condition of the Union.
Yes.
Northern Ireland and
yes.
Scotland. You were one of the leading figures in Vote Leave. When you look at the way in which Brexit has played out, is it worth it when it poses the threat that it does to the Union?
Well, I think the first thing is we were told during the referendum campaign that voting to leave would lead to declining support for the Union and declining support for unionist parties. And in fact, we saw that support for independence didn't rise, indeed it fell at the time. And we also saw the Scottish Conservative Party on an explicitly unionist ticket, led by, brilliantly by Ruth Davidson, dramatically increase its representation. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if we were to leave the European Union, the SNP would be in a far weaker position. They would be arguing not just that we should re-enter the EU and give back control, for example, of our fishing waters. They'd also be forced to ask the question, okay, now that you're leaving the UK, presumably you're abandoning the pound, are you joining the euro or having your own currency? I think it would raise a variety of questions about Scotland's future, which people would feel were best left unopened as our membership of the United Kingdom worked in their interests. In respect of Northern Ireland, again, the question there is we do and we have all sorts of benefits as a result of the Belfast Agreement, but it is also the case that a majority of the MPs who sit in the House of Commons representing Northern Ireland constituencies voted to leave. Now, a majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain. But we are one United Kingdom, and the voices which are strongly in favour of our membership of the United Kingdom in Parliament, with the exception of Sylvia Herman, who's a wonderful person, but the DUP are strongly in favour of our departure. So I don't think there's a necessary tension, no.
Now, who has the first question? Lots of questions. Where's the mic? So we'll go in the second row here with the first question.
Hi. Paul O'Red from North Wilts. In the disastrous event that we don't leave on the 31st and we have to nominate a commissioner, could I suggest Dominic Cummings or Nigel Farage?
Well, I'll pass that on to Tom later.
Now we have the first question down here.
Thank you. Owen Bennett from the Daily Telegraph. Hello, Michael. I just wanted to speak to you about Dominic Cummings. Are you comfortable with the language which seems to be coming out of Downing Street since Dominic Cummings is there in his role? And are you comfortable with actions like marching a special advisor off the premises with police? How do you feel about that?
I think it's always wise for any cabinet minister to approve of what Number 10 does.
But it's not conduct which has ended up really helping the government's position, is it?
Well, I think that I wasn't. Owen refers to a conversation to which I was not party. He talks about a set of events where I wasn't involved. One of the things that I do remember from my time working with some people in the past is that I've heard lurid stories about what individuals were alleged to have said or done behind closed doors in government departments, knew that it was not quite as accurate as it might have been. Recognise, of course, journalists try hard to get things right. I make no criticism of any journalist or any report, but I just say that sometimes, I don't know if you can imagine such a thing. Sometimes what actually happened is ever so slightly different from what was reported. So on that basis, I will have my wished.
Question in the fourth row here, lady here.
Thank you. Mr. Gove, in the light of the Supreme Court judgment this week, I think it's fair to say that any first-year law student would have advised the government that they were on solid ground following the judgment of the Lord Chief in the Divisional Court. But in that judgment in the Supreme Court, what they said quite late on in the judgment was that Parliament should not interfere with the role of government. And the rhetoric coming out of Downing Street is, we will abide by the law when it comes to the Surrender Act, or the Ben Act as it's called. Is it fair to say that the government has wriggle room now using that Supreme Court judgment to say the highest court in our land has made it very clear that Parliament cannot interfere with the role of government in negotiating treaties? And so, in fact, the government could turn to the Supreme Court and say, uphold what you've said. Parliament cannot stop us leaving on the 31st of October.
Well, one of the things, again, it's a very good question with a number of very interesting points. One of the things that it underlines to me is that both the Supreme Court judgment and some of the commentary on it repays thoughtful reading. There is to take a particular example, when it comes to foreign policy, it's broadly been understood in the past that the Crown in Parliament has the prerogative power to take foreign policy decisions to negotiate treaties and to take other steps. Now, Parliament has played a larger role over time in the exercise of that Crown prerogative power. That's an evolving thing. I wouldn't want to stick my toe into the water in that debate at this time, but I do think that you are right, that it is wise for all of us to reflect on how our constitution is evolving in that way.
But is it credible that there's a loophole that really that gets you out of this difficult situation, that he's going to have to write a letter of some sort, and Parliament has demonstrated at every single turn, it's now talking about potentially even impeaching the Prime Minister. Parliament's going to do anything, isn't it?
Well, we should wait and see. Parliament has asserted itself at times in the past, but I think that one of the interesting things that I've noted over the course of the last fortnight or so are the number of MPs who, not in Conservative held seats, who think that it's just best to get this done.
Next question. Now we have right at the very back, gentleman right at the very back.
I wonder if I could just press you on the question that Ian asked earlier about negotiating a deal now, because it seems to me that even if you had the greatest success, for instance, of just deleting the Irish backstop in its entirety, you'd be left with what is in fact just a rather expensive transition agreement. And of course, if you don't get quite that level of success, you'd have given more away, as it were, to the EU. For instance, the backstop itself means that when we come to negotiate any real free trade agreement or future relationship as set out in the political declaration, we really have no cards left in our hand. And therefore, when one talks about we must leave with a deal, as others do, I wonder whether they've actually thought about what that deal really ought to contain in terms of our future relationship, because nothing has been agreed in relation, for instance, to services. Very little has been agreed into a whole raft of other areas, except things that are really still very unacceptable. For instance, the rules cartel, this so-called level playing field. So I wonder if I just have a bit more detail on what really is the nature of a real deal that really is really acceptable.
Well, you draw your attention to you draw our attention collectively to a very important thing, which is that the withdrawal agreement is just stage one, a very important stage. It means that we do get Brexit done, we leave, but there is a future relationship which is contained in the political declaration. My own view is that we can build on the free trade agreements that the EU has concluded, not just with Canada, but with other countries like Japan and South Korea, and as well as those, we can have security arrangements given the relationship that we have with the EU, and cultural and scientific relationships given that countries from Israel to Switzerland have those, and I think that that would be the right sort of relationship for us. No, that's why if you conclude a withdrawal agreement, you can do that in the period thereafter, the 14 months thereafter.
But in the future talks about the future relationship, isn't it apparent that any government is really going to have to make a judgment about whether or not to be within the EU's orbit for the medium and the long term, or whether it wants to strike out on its own? Now, during the referendum campaign, the suggestion from Vote Leave was that there was this whole other world out there, and that we didn't need to be within the EU's orbit. Has your thinking adjusted?
We certainly don't need to be in the EU's orbit when it comes to single market rules, when it comes to ECJ jurisdiction. But there are some specific institutions or frameworks that are currently handled through the EU that it would be sensible, I think, for us to be part of in the future, particularly in the field of scientific and educational cooperation.
Next question. Second row here.
Hi, William James from Reuters. You said earlier that a no-deal Brexit was still possible. If I could just ask, is that still possible on October 31st? And if so, can you just talk us through the steps that lead to
that? The answer to the first question is yes. And the answer to the second question is to reflect on what Yogi Berra, the American baseball coach, said, which is one should never make predictions, especially about the future.
Gentleman in the front row here.
Hi, Michael. Thank you very much. I'm Ollie. I write for CityWire. From the excruciating practicalities of the current sort of Brexit process to the, shall we say, more theoretical sunlit uplands of the next few years after it's done, I just wondered if I could ask about regulation, in particular regulation of the City of London. Some Conservative Party members and MPs want to deregulate the City of London. What's your stance on that, and how long do you think it'll take to achieve whatever your view is?
I think we can certainly regulate financial institutions better, and I think that it would be an organic process.
But there was this at the heart of the argument within government under the previous Prime Minister. One of the major arguments was that the Treasury, under Philip Hammond, took the view that Brussels could and should regulate financial services. The Bank of England took a very robust and different view.
Correct.
Does the Bank of England view hold?
Yes.
Right. And this was on the basis that the UK cannot be regulated effectively by email from
Yes, so
Brussels, but you're going to need any government's going to need a very close relationship with the European Union on financial services.
I think the EU needs a close relationship with the UK on financial services more. But
Question right let's go fifth row here. There are two hands up here.
Thank you. Do you think the Fixed Term Parliament Act should be repealed?
Tuffy. Yes.
So is that, if there is a Conservative majority after the next election, you think that that's a priority?
It's not the top priority. The top priority is the economy, and then it probably won't surprise you to hear me say the NHS, education and crime. However, and they are the most important things. There's certainly, the things which matter most to the public, the areas of public policy in which I'm most interested. I mentioned earlier that I was a small c Conservative on constitutional reform. I can understand why the Fixed Term Parliament Act was introduced, but I don't think it really works in our system.
But it, of course, was introduced by your old friends.
Yes.
And some people warned at the time that it was a constitutional monstrosity that would lead to zombification of government. It turned out to be a disaster, didn't it?
Well, opinion divides on the question of the FTPA. But again, it's one of the lessons I draw from that is that it's a mistake to try to design constitutional structures in response to one specific event. So it was a mistake, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, to do it just because of the specific circumstances of the coalition, though I can understand why it was put forward at the time. And in the same way, it would be a mistake in response to, say, a single judgment of the Supreme Court to suddenly say, right, we need to change the way in which it operates in this way. I think it's better to look at these things in the round.
I mean, was it really done because they were desperate to get into government and to ensure that that government survived as long as possible?
Well, there were several reasons. I wasn't privy to the conversations, but part of it was that from the point of view of both Conservative and Liberal Democrat negotiators, they wanted to ensure that there could be 5 full years in which the necessary steps in order to deal with the financial crash could be taken.
And I think George Osborne added an extra year.
I wasn't there, but I did read, I think, in the Times.
Almost no one will now admit to having been there when it was done. It's extraordinary.
No, I wasn't.
Someone involved said to me the other day, I think I thought there was going to be a sunset clause or something.
No, I wasn't in the coalition talks. They were very successful, though. I was in the talks between the Conservatives and Labour over the withdrawal agreement. Those talks didn't work, so I think it's probably a good idea if these sort of cross-party talks are left to people other than me.
Another question in the same row.
Thank you. I know that myself and many others in the event of a no-deal Brexit really worry about kind of the limiting opportunities that it could have with the uncertainty, but you do talk about the benefits. Could you kind of clarify what you see as the benefits are of a no-deal Brexit if we were in that situation?
Yes. I think that there are benefits to Brexit overall. I think that it's better to leave, as I say, with a deal than without a deal. But there are a number of areas where we can do things differently. The first thing is that as an independent country, it's possible for us in a huge variety of areas to set the rules and regulations in a way that will encourage scientific innovation. So outside the European Union, we can take steps on everything from gene editing to clinical trials of medicine that mean that we can produce the food that the world needs more effectively. We can tread more lightly on the planet environmentally, and we can make sure that there are some diseases and conditions from which people are suffering that we can treat more rapidly and that we can develop cures for more effectively. I think it's also the case that outside the EU, we can adopt a tariff schedule that means that developing countries benefit from freer trade with us. They grow wealthier, and at the same time, we can keep critical commodity prices down in the UK, which also helps consumers here and helps our economy grow. It's also the case that we can take steps on security. which we can't take inside the EU in order to make it tougher for some people who are either criminals or who wish us ill to enter the UK. And it is also the case that we can secure trade deals with other countries which enable us again to pioneer in a variety of areas economic growth, including, as has been pointed out by the Prime Minister, economic growth in some of our more challenging and more economically sort of difficult areas through the operation of free ports and other innovations which allow us to attract this sort of enterprise that within the current constraints of EU membership we can't.
Lots of hands up. Question here in the second row. Gentleman here.
Paul Chapman from Wigan. Do you think Parliament has the numbers for Margaret Beckett or Ken Clarke to lead a caretaker government or government of national unity? And if not, can you see a point in the future where the government might vote against itself to force a general election?
No, I don't think so. I think I've got nothing against Margaret Beckett or against Ken Clarke. But I can't see how you can have a government of national unity on the basis that you're saying that 52% of the people in this country are going to have their wishes thwarted. That doesn't seem particularly unifying. The other thing that's interesting, though, I think, as well, students of history will remember that at different times, British politics has been fluid, at other times less so. We had a particularly fluid time in the 1920s. And we had a parliament in 1923, after an election in 1923, we had a parliament in 1924, Ramsay MacDonald's first parliament, and you had three parties of broadly equal size, Liberals, Labour, Conservative. And we had an election after that Labour government fell, in which Stanley Baldwin massively increased his majority. Sometimes it is the case when you have what is viewed by the country as a dysfunctional parliament, that the Prime Minister, who has the clearest view about how to break the logjam, does very, very well. I would never normally compare Boris to Stanley Baldwin, but I do think that faced with the logjam that we have at the moment, then there may well be echoes in the way in which Stanley Baldwin managed to secure a dramatic majority in 1924.
If you do get into that territory, though, and you're into the middle of the 14-day period, and your opponents are attempting to come up with a person, what requirements will the palace have? Will the palace really settle for 320 names, or will it want, as it was put to me, a bit of insurance, more like 330, 340 names?
I think recent events suggest that it's unwise for frontline politicians to speculate about what Her Majesty might do in any given set of circumstances.
I'll ask you about the Cameron book in a moment.
Yes, so I'm not going to suggest that that Her Majesty should raise an eyebrow about any of these particular prospects.
But but they may have the votes to trigger that process, but not they may not have 320, let alone 330 or 340 votes to agree on who that person should be. So it's possible would you just run down the clock in those circumstances?
I think at the moment you are absolutely right that it doesn't seem as though you can get a majority in the House of Commons to say that Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn won't step aside as leader of the opposition and allow a consensus to be formed behind anyone else. So those seem to be the facts at the moment. Beyond that, I think it would be foolish for me to speculate.
What about your former Conservative colleagues and cabinet colleagues who are in the middle of this and working out what to do and having a crisis of conscience? What would you recommend?
That they let me know precisely what they're thinking. And then I can try and persuade them out of it.
But Ken Clarke seems prepared to put in Jeremy Corbyn, and then graciously says if that's not agreeable, he'll do it himself. If you're David Gauke or something, you're looking at this. You didn't, exiled though you are, you didn't come into politics to put Jeremy Corbyn in power. Presumably you have a message for him.
Most of the messages that I pass on to Ken Clarke or David are probably best passed on privately. But the other thing, though, that is Ken's a Conservative, David's a Conservative. I sat around the cabinet table with both of them. I might disagree with them on aspects of this particular issue, but you know, there are all sorts of things that are going to have to be achieved in this country after this particular issue is resolved, and I hope that people, you know, within the Conservative Party who've got talents like David's and elder statesmen with experience like Ken can be involved intimately in shaping the future of our country, and I also hope that people outside the Conservative Party can be as well. It's just important that we break this logjam.
Now, where's the we have a mic here, so let's have question, I think 5 rows back there, if we can get a mic.
Thanks. I just wanted to bring up something that you said earlier about the views on offensive language used by MPs. And you sort of suggested that this kind of language isn't new and that, you know, it happened in the past. Surely there are many things that happened in the past which are absolutely unacceptable now. And I just want to ask if you really think that language can be defended.
Well, I think that you are right that the wheel of history turns, and we look back on the past and sometimes wonder what motivated people to act in that way. But I do think that robust political debate and free speech are really important in our country. And of course, you should always be respectful of the experience of others, and in particular, you should have a care at a time of heightened emotions and concerns about the impact of your words. But one of the things that is essential to our democracy, it was summed up by Milton and Areopagitica. It was advanced by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. It was at the heart of what we believed in throughout the 20th century when we were taking on totalitarianisms of all kind, is that you must have freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. It is the fundamental freedom on which everything else depends. And of course, you can criticize people, you can regret things, you can invite them to apologize. But one of the things that I sometimes worry about is that there are certain things which are believed to be unthinkable and certain things which are believed to be unsayable. And once we start policing people's minds and policing people's words, then we enter into a very difficult situation. Who is to do the policing? Who decides what I can think and what I can say? And in that sense, I think the single most important thing is that even if people misspeak, even if they get something wrong, even if they're sometimes clumsy in the way in which they express themselves, can we please remember that the fundamental liberty on which the institutions that we respect are based is freedom of speech, and we must stand up for it.
Now, there are a lot of hands up, so let's take a batch of 3 questions because we are in danger of running out of time. And please say if you're from, if you're a Conservative Party member, where you're from, or if you're from the media, please say. Question right here first, but we'll take 3 in a row.
Chris Bowers from Harrow East. One of the ways that you can stand up. One of the ways that you can potentially get around the Benn Act is to try and persuade the European Council not to give an extension. And I guess you could say to them, well, look, you know, this is the deal. This will help us go back to Parliament and say, it's this deal or no deal. If you were in that situation, if you were in the room and trying to persuade the European Council not to give an extension, how would you go about it?
Well,
it's a good question. Let's just take we'll just take 3, just so as many people get a chance.
Absolutely.
Just 2 behind there. Yep. Perfect. Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Hodgson-Jones, Hertsmere. Whatever happens on the 31st of October, whether we leave with a deal or without a deal, or we haven't got a deal, but one day we leave, we will need to negotiate new free trade agreements with various entities. Should we prioritise the EU, which is notoriously slow, or should we prioritise other countries where we might secure an agreement faster?
Question, and then just right in front there. Yep.
Thank you. My name's Andy. I work for a national support provider for adults with learning disabilities and autism. I'm wondering what specifically is being done to mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit on social care, as set out in the Yellowhammer documents, particularly in the face of a significant funding gap for social care that's been addressed but not fully solved with the most recent spending review.
Michael, you want to
Thank
take
you.
those?
On the first, at the risk of repeating myself, I think some of the points I made earlier about why it wouldn't be in the EU's interests to prolong this process, I think are the arguments that I would make. Obviously, they must make their own mind up, but Geoffrey Cox has talked about Dante's Purgatory, and one of the things that I think he's right about is that we don't want this to carry on. We want to end it, and it would be in the EU's interest as well to have their ransomed souls escape from purgatory and into paradise. On the FTAs, I think there's a balance here. We can, I think, relatively quickly conclude FTAs with a variety of countries with whom we have good bilateral relationships. I think one of the other things that we should do is do everything we can to get the CPTPP concluded. But I also think it's important that we have the right trading relationship with the EU as well. That shouldn't come at the price of submitting to the regulatory strictures of the single market, but I think we can get there. And on the point about social care, it's a huge issue. One of the things that I would say is that I mentioned earlier some of the challenges that we associate with a potential no deal. I think that those challenges can be mitigated, not in every area, but in most areas. But acknowledging that means that we should then zoom in on the broader challenges that we face in social care overall. We need to make sure that we have equitable funding for the future. We need to think about, in particular, some of the pressures on costs, not least labour costs. We need to think about how we can ensure that we balance the dignity that people should enjoy with the necessary reforms that we need to make in order to ensure that we can spread the burden of payment equitably. These are big questions. Matt Hancock is focusing on them. You're absolutely right to remind us that at a time of change, we should always put the vulnerable first in our mind, and that's what we are doing.
Final question from me. We did mention the Cameron book, and you were such close friends. Is the friendship, do you think, repairable?
Well,